Now we need to write for our sprite sheet. Okay, I've got texture on the left side, resource on the right side, and we can also toggle to see what we're working with the README. I'm going to press Control / to get rid of that sidebar. And now let's if and def. So hash if and def. We can say texture HPP, and then define it. Hash define texture HPP. Now in here, namespace GE like always. And this class, texture, is going to be a child of our parent class resource. So let's include resource. Hash include resource.hpp. So here we can say it is a child of resource, so resource, and it is going to hold SF texture. And now we also need to include our SFML / graphics, so that way it knows where texture is coming from. I'll move that above. So let's add curly braces and end that with a semicolon. Create our public scope. And one thing we'll want to change real quick is in resource, we have a private scope. Well, we want to be able to access this map inside our texture class. So let's change this to a protected scope. And now texture will be able to access resources. Another thing is we will want to say public here to define that our parent class is a public class. And let's now override load. So here we can say virtual void load. Now we can override it. So let's copy this. So before our is loop, we're going to want to define a couple new variables. We'll first want to have an SF image, and we can just call this image. We will want to have a string, so standard string, and we can call this temp name. We can also have a standard vector that holds strings, and we can call this temp rect. So our temporary name will be this here, so whatever we name it, and then our temporary rect will hold the width, height, and chords of whatever's going on, and our image will hold whatever image we want to be taking these textures from. Oh, and we're getting an error up here, graphics. This should be graphics.hpp, and that should fix the error. All right, as we're getting an error here, possibly due to these being named to the same thing, as we are just function overriding, let's change the name real quick. Instead of having it be load, let's have this be read. All right, in README, we have this call right here, sprite sheet, and this will be kind of like a command to read in a sprite sheet. And so let's check to see if our first is equal to sprite sheet to see if there's that command. So if our first equals sprite sheet, then we can just run load of first root plus second and end that with a semicolon. Now, whenever we load in an image, we say SS image, as you can see here, and then our image path. So this image will become whatever this path is. It'll load it into this image. So here we can say if first equals SS image, then we can do basically what we do here in resource under the load. So we can copy up to here, paste this over. And instead of having this be resource object, as we don't need to have this be resource object, as we know what type it is, we can just say if not image.load from file. And then we don't need to delete it if it doesn't work. And could not load resource, we can just say from path and then have our path here. All right, now this will load in the image and it will store it. Now we want to check to see if we have a bracket. So we can say if first equals, and this will just be an open bracket, then we know that we have multiple images being loaded in. So we'll want a Boolean to check to see if this is true. So let's add that up here. Bool multi equals false. So it starts off not being a multiple line value. We can say multi equals true here. And then we can assign our temp name to the first value. Temp name equals first, as that's what's right here. And then we can continue. Now, if we are in a multiple image and we're on a line for that, we're going to want to push that back onto our temp rect. And so because there is no colon in this, we'll want to check to see if we are currently inside a multi-line texture. And we can say if not multi. So here, if we're inside a multi-resource, we can say multi. So if it's multi, we can then push it back onto temp rect. So temp rect dot push back, and this will just be temp. A colon here, and we can just load in our resource otherwise. So inside our sprite sheets, we can still load in resources the normal way, or we can read them in the multi-line way. And the last thing we will want to do is check to see if we can find a closing bracket. So if temp.find single quotes, and this is our closing bracket, does not equal standard string and pos, then we found a closing bracket. So we will create a new function and we can call this spritesheet. And what spritesheet is going to contain is it's going to contain our image, our temp name, and our temp rect. We can end that with a semicolon, and then we will, after that, set multi to false, and we will clear our rectangle. So after we've read it in, we can just clear our temporary rectangle. And then we can continue as we will be done with that line. So now to get rid of this error, let's create this function and let's have capital S's on it. So void sprite sheet, and this will take a SF image, and we can just call this image. It will take our standard string and name, and it will also take our standard vector, standard string, and we can just call this rect. And we'll have an and sign in front of it as well. Now we can create an array of textures. So SF texture star text, and we'll have this be a pointer array, and we'll say new SF texture of, and we'll have that as rect.size, and that with a semicolon. And now we can have a loop for unsigned int I equals 0, I less than our rect.size, and then I plus plus, and here we will get our texture from our image. So we can create a temporary string, so standard string, and we can just call this temp, as this other temp is outside of the scope as they're in different functions, equals rect.at I.substring, and we're going to start at 4, as in this we're going to have 4 spaces before each value for width, height, x, y. And that will go to rect.at I.size -1, and we can end that with a semicolon. Now we will want the width, so we can say int w equals standard stoi, so string to integer, temp dot substring, And this will start at 0 and it will go until we find a space. So temp.find, and this will be our space. And we can end that with a semicolon. And now we're going to get rid of the W from temp, so we can say temp equals temp.substring, and this will be temp.find, our space in single quotes as it is a character, plus 1 as we're skipping the character itself, to temp.size minus 1. All right, and now for height, we can just copy this int for the width, paste that down, and switch this to h. And since we cut out W with this line right here, it will get that h value. And now we can just copy and paste this 2 more times. And we can set this to x, and we can set this to y, and we don't need this substring as the last value is what temp is. So we can remove that and save it. And now we have our w, h, x, and y variables. And now we can create an SF interact. We can call this selection x, y, width, and height. And end that with semicolon. Now we can say if not text at I dot load from image, and we will have img here and selection here. So if it can't load that image from that selection, then we can say standard cout error in loading single tick name single tick, and then standard mline. And then we can standard exit with the value of -1 and end that with a semicolon. And now one thing we can do real quick right here is say in iteration and then plop down I. And we can delete text as an array, so delete text as an array to try and prevent memory leaks. And now down here we can load in our texture. So we can say resources at our name equals resource object array of, we can say SF texture, and then we can have open and close parentheses and say text, and then throw in the size, which is rect.size. And end that with the semicolon. And we also need to say new in the front, as it's a new resource object array. All right, real quick to fix this up, instead of saying path here to load image from file, because we're not trying to load in the texture as the image, we're trying to load it from right here, what this second value is. We can say root plus second. Another thing we need to debug / fix is here. This should not say load, this should say read. And we don't need this first value as it's sprite sheet. We're just reading it from the path that we're providing here. Let's indent that for some more white space. Oh, and instead of checking first here as this opens right here, we need to check against second. Now let's go into our main.cpp, our temp main.cpp, and now it's getting an error as this should be read. All right, let's test it out by going into our temp image texture.config, and we can just state this right here as it's reading in the texture. So we can say, instead of YouTube image here, we can say SS image, and then down here we can now say YT image and colon. And down here we can give it a width, let's say something like 200 by 200, and then the X can be something like 200 and 200. We can have another one 100 by 400 at 100 by 300. Then we can save this. Inside main, we have our read in, and now if we have YT image, make sure these match up. They do. Save it. We need to quickly switch this from GE resources to the actual texture itself to load it in. So let's go into GE and let's include texture as well. So hash include, and then resource / texture.hpp. We can save that. Now in main, we can say GE texture. Let's try loading in this second image to see if anything shows up. We may need to use a different image as we may be just selecting a dark part of it, and so it might not be easy to see what's going on. Alright, so I'm going to throw in another image instead of this one because this one seems to be too dark. Alright, I've placed in this as our image as it's a lot brighter, and also this is another image I have taken, so I won't get copyright infringed. And as we can see, it shows up, and so the width is small and the height must be really large for this one. So Alt F4, change the width and height for the second value. Let's say 600 by 500. So the width is 600, the height is 500. Now if we make run it, you can see it's selecting a part of it. And I switched the X and Y coordinate, not the width and height coordinate. So that's my bad. Let's switch the width and height coordinate right here. So for the width, we can say 600 again, and for the height, we can just leave it as 400. Now, if we make main.exe, we can see it's selecting the image, Alt F4. And if we go back into main and switch this from 1 to 0, which is this top texture right here, it should be a box. And let's run it, make main.exe. And we got that, it's a box. Now, in our main file, we don't want to have to keep typing out to read in from the textures and the fonts and all of those. We want to be able to have this main config file, which will read in the texture, font, and audio all for us. So let's write that real quick in our ge.hpp. Let's create this right below our data. We can say inline void read, and we can have standard string path in here. Now let's go into our resource and let's copy this main read function from here, as it will be somewhat similar. Alright, for this part we're going to want to define which ones we can read in, and so I'm going to define font and texture up here in our data struct. So we will say texture, now just lowercase texture, and then resource sf font. So now we have texture and font defined, and I'll have a lowercase f there. Now we should also pass in data, what we're using, and here we can say if our first equals texture, like in this example, readme here, then we're going to load it from the texture. So we'll say data arrow texture dot load, or dot read, and then our path, which is root plus second, and that with a semicolon. And now we can copy this and paste it and switch this to font, and the same thing goes here in data. We can say font and save that. All right, now we've got the main function to read it in. So inside main, we could get rid of these we could say ge read and then data, and let's say our config path is in source and there's a new folder. We can call this res for resources and it's in there. We can just call it main.config. All right, so here we can say src/res/main.config, and that with the semicolon. And now inside main.config, if we specify something like texture and say maybe it's an image slash and then texture.config, we can create a new folder in here, call this image, and have a new file, call this texture.config. And let's say we move our image file into here, and we can just copy this over into texture.config, save that, remove it from here. Now if we go back into main and again have the private and then sf sprite temp, render temp here, so data arrow window dot draw temp, we can set temp in here, so temp dot set texture equal to data arrow texture dot get resource, and then our value right here, so yt capital img, yt img of value 0, and that with a semicolon. And now we make main.exe. We can see it's loading in the resources properly. So anytime we want a new image, we can just throw it into our texture, or we can create a separate .ss config for sprite sheets that we have, and we can load in a whole bunch of textures from just one file.